balance. What is balance? Balance in the visual world. So there is an appearance of visual weight. There's an implied visual weight that our visual elements have within our composition or within our frame. So we know that large objects tend to visually weigh more than smaller objects. Dark objects tend to feel more heavy and thus weigh more than light objects. And so with this whole balance, position is really critical. The different types of balances that are most common, we have a symmetrical balance, and this is just a mirrored image. So it's very similar or even exactly the same from side to side, and this can be vertical or horizontal. We have asymmetrical balanced. This still looks balanced just because it's asymmetrical, meaning it's not the same from side to side. It's not a mirror image, but it still is balanced. So in asymmetrical balance, the objects are not centered in the frame. Mainly, they're using something like rule of thirds to arrange or compose, but it still feels balanced. Last one that's very common is radial balance, and this is the circular style of composition. So all the objects radiate out from a center point. So here's an example with some fulcrums, and you can see how things are balanced. We have to move that center point to allow for those heavier objects, or we have to add more objects, more smaller objects to equal one larger object. So a couple of examples here to look at how balance works. So we're going to look at asymmetrical balance because this tends to be the more troublesome of the balances. So in this case, you absolutely agree that it's asymmetrical, but is it properly balanced? Does it feel like it's going to tip over? It feels as though the right side is a little bit more heavy, and that the water, even though there's some background buildings, there's not enough visual weight there. So we have a very dominant right side. If we were to just move the camera slightly and take another photo here, this feels more balanced. And so the objects are going in and through, but if I were to put kind of that fulcrum there, you might feel as though it's fairly balanced. And what's funny is there's a little post with the bird on at the bottom that almost feels like that's the center point. A few more examples here, and you think about whether this is balanced and how just a slight change can change the overall balance or feel. So if we look at this example, the bird feeder and the bird. So some could say it feels a little bit off to the right. However, you can kind of feel where that balance, where that visual weight is leading. Now, if the bird turns, that gives you a whole different feel. It makes the movement go more to that bottom corner. And if I move the bird once again, you get the feeling of it sort of picking back up. It's moving. It's not as lopsided over to that far right. So the implied balance is part of this as well. So we talked about rule of thirds, and we'll talk much more about that composition next week. But this is where we see our picture being divided up into what I call a tic-tac-toe board over top. You break it into thirds, so you ended up with 9 boxes, if you can think of it that way. Typically, we don't like to center or have the heavy visual weight be in the exact center. This is another example here. And again, it's very much asymmetrical, but what you have to think about is that okay? Does the positive space equal the negative space? Now in this case, this is my dog. He's kind of looking over to the left, or the left of the photo. There's a little bit of that visual weight that then leaves and goes that way to help with the balance. So some people might find this to be an acceptable composition, and others may feel that it's way too heavy on the right. So visual balance, it's very subjective in that many people feel different ways when looking. Some people are more tolerant or more acceptable. However, it's something to think about. And the key thing here, I think, is that you don't have to center everything right in the middle.